Camilla, Sharon, Judith, Linda, '99. Hello from Florida. Hello from Texas.
I was really excited by it.
Yeah, and Ludmilla. Hello, Ludmilla. Hi.
Hello there, Diana. I'm from Maryland.
You're from Maryland. Oh, great. Alexandria, Helen, Ellen, California, Rochester, New York, Chicago.
Okay.
Hello, Michael.
Hello, Diana.
Hello, Norway. Hello, Sue from Toronto, San Francisco. I'm from Bath.
Oh, I love it.
Hello from Glasgow, Oklahoma. Oh, terrific.
I didn't know that all this was going to happen. Look.
Edinburgh.
Diana, how many people are booked in for tonight?
Well, we've got 99 so far. And there's somebody else, lots of people from Bath, someone else from Florida.
Well. Now,
That's beautiful.
why can't we see them all?
Well, they're flashing up, so I am sort of seeing them.
Hello, Angela.
Hello.
Hello,
Hello, Angela.
Hello, Diana.
Hi.
What?
Somebody from Michigan, Christine.
Oh, there I go.
Have unmuted it.
Ah.
I'm in Bath. Hello, Robin from Bath.
Oh, here we are. We can run.
There's Angela. Hi, Angela.
Hi. Can you hear
Daisy.
me?
Hello, Daisy. Boring Bath for me too. You've done all your networking. That's brilliant. Thank you.
Hello from Hereford.
Hello, Kelly. Amelia, hello, Norfolk. Hi. Somebody said she'd rather be in Bath. I wonder who that was.
I think we'd all rather be in Bath.
Hello, Mary Ellen.
Hi there.
Hello, Marion from Cardiff.
Betty Sushars is there. Laura.
Right, well, I'm going to... Oh, Jude. Hello, Jude. Just a Bathonian. I know who you are, Jude. It's very damp. I agree, yes.
Here we are. Gosh.
Is that Anne? Hello, Anne. Well, we're up to 100 people now.
Wow.
What?
I am going to start off. Hello, Laura, because as they come in, they're not going to miss anything very much, I don't think. So anyway, welcome to everyone. It's really wonderful. Good evening, and it's the second of our Jane Austen lockdown talks. Had life not interrupted, this would have taken place this afternoon at 3 o'clock and followed by tea and cakes, which is always good. But events did overtake us, as we all know. And so here we are. And this is a scheduled Grizzly evening talk. But of course, the huge difference is that we're doing it via Zoom. So we've got people from all around the world, which is really, really exciting. There's always a silver lining, something like a lockdown and a virus. And this is it. Now, when our talks are finished, they get put on to the website, and this one is going to be posted in about 3 to 4 weeks' time. So it will be available for anybody to rewatch or for people who've not been able to log on, because I know that people in America are on different time scales and sometimes it's just not possible. So they will be able to see it. Now, the other thing I have to remind you is when our speaker starts, can you please all turn off your videos and go on mute? Questions afterwards, if you would like to put them in the chat box, which is alongside your screen. And finally, and this is most important, if your screen freezes, then what you have to do is log out and then log in again. And the reason that it might possibly freeze is because there are so many people here tonight on Zoom. So it does happen. So if it does, then log out and log back in. Right, now all it's left for me to do is to introduce our speaker. Dr. Georgina Newton has been a university lecturer and teacher for some years. She's currently teaching and lecturing at De Montfort University, but she's also volunteering at a local primary school, so she's really got an awful lot on her plate. Her particular interest is in the education of girls, especially those from poorer backgrounds. She spent several years researching their experiences of life, how they see their future, and whether they feel their economic disadvantages discriminate against them. What she has learned has given her a passionate wish for these girls' voices to be heard and their chances in life to reflect their abilities. Dr. Newton's own feminist beliefs, coupled with her love of literature, led her to Jane Austen and her feminism, which of course she could only express in her novels. So Georgina has taken off from a very busy teaching schedule to time to give us this talk, and we are delighted to welcome her here this evening. So your speaker tonight, everybody, Georgina Newton.
A headphone.
Thank you very much, Diana. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. Although it's virtual, it's fab to talk to everybody. And I was just said earlier, I was reflecting on how this is quite a cool way to spend a Saturday evening, at least a Saturday evening if you're in the UK, being sort of self-indulgent and talking about my PhD. I still love, despite having spent a lot of time writing it. So my PhD, a little sort of insight into that, as Diana rightly introduced, it was about sort of working class girls and how they imagine their futures. I was fortunate enough to work with 11 and 12-year-old girls from working class backgrounds through focus groups, but they also helped me in the research. It was co-participatory, and my thesis developed from that. But, you know, and ultimately what developed was an understanding of the challenges that working class girls face today, but also the feminist tone within which they attempt to engage with their worlds. Often we negate young girls thinking they're not interested in feminism anymore, or, you know, they're just interested in posting their next latest picture on Instagram. Whereas actually what really came through from them is they don't quite know how to vocalize it and formulate it, but they are definitely talking from a feminist perspective. So that sort of leads me to reflect on Jane Austen and how she equally talks from that perspective. One thing just to note is all the girls chose their own pseudonyms. So I've got a couple of quotes from them. So please just ignore the slightly interesting names that they chose for themselves. That was nothing to do with me. So in terms of Jane Austen was, you know, writing in the 18th century, and her novels have been seen as a comment on society and life at this time. Initially, many critics considered Jane Austen's work conservative or reflecting conservative views and beliefs, and sort of suggesting that Austen was really reflecting the social position of women and potentially supporting existing social structures. However, other readings more recently have suggested that Austen does actually challenge the patriarchal structures of her society at the time. And this sort of critical reading of Austen developed quite considerably during the 1970s. Lloyd Brown suggested that Jane Austen's themes were comparable to Mary Wollstonecraft's feminist discussions of the 18th century, because they had challenged those masculine assumptions in society. The extent to which the novels reflect feminist themes has been extensively debated by scholars. Most critics agree the novels highlight how some female characters take charge of their own world, while others are confined physically and spiritually. And when reflecting on my own research, this is something the girls working with me often highlighted. The attempt by themselves and other girls in their world to take charge of their worlds in the face of what they consider societal confinement and the rules and restrictions and expectations that working class girls face today. So despite the hope that women's position in society has moved on, and irrefutably it has in many ways, I sit here in a position that I would say, I argue that beneath the surface there remains a battle for women between the structural confines they face due to their gender, but also due to their class or race position, but also their position as mothers or daughters, sisters, and that conflicts with their wish to create their own destiny through a freedom of choice. And choice is an interesting concept in terms of what choices women actually have, both in Austen's time and with the girls that I'd worked with. The limited subject matter within Austen's novels, focused on the home, women and relationships, have been recently critiqued to explore the feminist tone and undercurrent that runs through her work as she offers a coded view of the position of society and women. We have to appreciate that Austen was writing at a time where women writers had to tread carefully. The structure and influence of gender relations that were part of the environment in which Austen wrote impacted on what Austen could write and how she could write it. Austen's style and subject matter are responses both overt and covert to the patriarchal English gentry, in which women's lives were constricted in many ways that men's weren't. And perhaps that is one of the key things that has actually changed today. The girls I worked with were never afraid of saying what they thought, to the point of being very open with me throughout my research. They never had to censor themselves in the way that Austen did. So whereas Austen's reflections and critiques of society and the position of women may often have been quite covert, the girls in my research could be very overt about it. So progress has been made. Let's take that from that. So the girls were quite happy to openly criticise gendered inequality. So the following slides are structured in a way to highlight some of the themes that Austen highlights, but also how they can be seen in accordance with the girls that I work with. So one of the first things that I was thinking about is I actually did my research from a socialist feminist perspective, looking at how both class and gender constrict the young girls of today. And this led me to reflect on, was Jane Austen actually potentially a socialist feminist in some way? And I'll explain why I think this. So research by Claudia Johnson in 1988 suggested Austen's novels may be limited in terms of subject matter to women, the home, marriage and society. However, that doesn't suggest that Austen had a limited political understanding or was compliant with the male-dominated culture of the time. Rather, she suggests that Austen had a consciousness of how the private is political. This statement, that notion of how the private, the personal sphere is actually political and tied to the political system of the world, highlights the personal or private position of women as a site of struggle, which is later found when we think about sort of feminist movement. We later see this notion of the private being political emerging in second wave feminism of the 1960s and 70s. Hanisch wrote an essay on the topic entitled "The Personal is Political," highlighting how women's personal experiences can be traced to their location within power relationships. Men's power and women's oppression within the personal or private sphere is reflective of political and societal oppressions. Therefore, the issues Jane Austen is commenting on, the restriction of women's lives and confinement to the personal sphere, were still evident in the core of women's lives in the 1960s. So arguably, this relationship between the personal life of women and the private life, and the confines within that domestic sphere, are still evident in the 60s and 70s. And this is linked to the naturalisation of women's position within the home, both in Austen's time and arguably even today. And very much linked to women's ability to give birth, situates women at home, the assumption of women giving birth and then having maternity leave, for example. This was underlined by de Beauvoir in 1997, who highlighted that women's role as a mother is fundamental to the development of inequalities. And Juliet Mitchell, writing in 1975, suggests these elements cannot merely be considered in isolation. They form a structure of specific interrelations. The contemporary family can be seen as a triptych of sexual, reproductive and socialisatory functions which is the woman's world, which is embraced by production, which is the man's world, precisely a structure in which the final instance is determined by the economy. Economic demands are accompanied by coherent policies from those elements. So these feminists are talking about how that private world that women are encased within serve a function for the public world that men inhabit. Because if the home is looked after and contained and constrained and women take care of the home, it frees the man up to take care of the public sphere. So in light of this, I sort of looked at my young girls and again, because I was studying gender and class, this socialist feminist perspective, and looked at how the personal is political for them and how the lives of the girls are going to intersect around work, home life and children. So it's clear that this view of women's experiences continues. The girls most certainly are not confined in the same ways as women were in Austen's time. However, they do still examine restrictions to their choices and discuss how their personal lives will impact on and confine their lives in the public sphere. The girls fully expected having to sacrifice something if they wished to work and have children and have a relationship. Now, bearing in mind these young girls were only 11 and 12, they were already very aware that societally there was going to be a balance that they would have to strike. Although they can choose jobs and careers, they showed a knowledge and in some cases acceptance that they will potentially have to sacrifice their careers in some way for their personal lives. This isn't to say these girls were happy about it. They acknowledged the roles they were expected to play in the personal or private world and the impact that that would have on other aspects of their lives. But they really fought against that and they were very outspoken about it. And girls commented things like, I don't think they, as in women, should just like give up work just to look after the children because they don't want to spend their entire lives just staying at home. They want to do something for themselves. And another girl suggested that they, as in women, do all the work. And this leads us to Mildred, who said, yeah, they do everything and women just sit back and do nought. Now, these particular girls were very outspoken about the roles their fathers took within the home. And they very much saw the home in their experiences as the domain of women and women being responsible for the home, while men got to enjoy the public world. And the sort of notion that women were expected to look after children, do the housework, do the cleaning and cooking, and suggested that this is reflective of women's oppressed position within a wider society. And again, the personal being political suggests that if women are restricted to the personal life and they have the demands placed on them at home, they can't fulfill their world in terms of the political. So the knowledge of the primary responsibility for the home and children continues to fall on women and shapes their experiences. They don't like it, but they know that they'll have to try and juggle everything or in fact sacrifice something. And discussions with the girls highlighted how this argument remains relevant today, with evidence that women continue to take that responsibility. So I would say in many ways that personal political theme still very much exists in young girls' lives today. Moving on to marriage. Now, this is obviously a key theme running throughout Austen's work. And marriage, as Austen knew it, involved a woman giving up everything for her husband, her money, her body, and her existence as a legal adult. Husbands could abuse their wives, imprison them, or take their children away within the bounds of the law. And marriage mattered because it's a defining action of a woman's life. To accept or refuse a proposal was almost the only decision a woman could make for herself. It was the only way a woman could exert control over her life. For Austen, marriage and children were a girl's natural and best aspiration. Austen realised that women without independent means felt very great pressure to marry someone who could look after them because otherwise they would be a burden on their families. The marriage market that she described is quite detailed and well understood by all concerned. For example, as explained in Mansfield Park, Miss Maria Ward, with only £7,000, had the good luck to captivate a baronet. Her uncle, the lawyer, allowed her to be at least £3,000 short of any equitable claim to it. To indulge in a marriage less lucrative than might have been expected was regarded as throwing oneself away, and someone like Mary Crawford, who prided herself on her realism, could not bring herself to do it. Austen uses irony to shine a light on the marriage market. I'm sure you all recognise this quote, and the need for marriage for women in the era. So the opening line of Pride and Prejudice: "It is a truth universally acknowledged, so that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." However, the reality is, maybe a man needs a wife to produce an heir and to look after his house. But as Pride and Prejudice goes on to demonstrate, it's actually not the man that needs a wife, but rather the women that need the fortunes of the men that they seek to marry or they find to marry. So although this situation of inheritance, dowries, and women needing husbands has considerably moved on, I'd like to draw comparisons to the girls' discussions about relationships, marriage, and their futures.
God.
At a first glance, much of what the girls said suggested relationships and marriage would take a backseat in their lives. The girls had quite a complex relationship with boys in many ways, because on the one hand, they denied that they were interested in boys, but suggested other girls were interested in boys. And othering and the notion of talking about others sort of hides a little bit what the girls are really saying. Again, we have to be aware that I was working with 11 and 12-year-old girls, so therefore rightly they shouldn't be thinking about marriage, or ideally they shouldn't be thinking about marriage. What was interesting to me was how, despite many academics suggesting working class girls often have more conservative and domestic aspirations, all of the girls in my research were clearly focused on getting a good education, a good job or career first, before considering relationships. Many of the girls, and they named themselves Dreamwork, Wolf and Mac, suggested marriage was not important. These girls were very focused on being independent, often rejected the notion of permanent romantic relationships, particularly early on in their adult lives. And this supports some research by Weiss, who suggests working class girls were critical of marriage and the romantic ideal. However, many of the girls did ultimately expect to be married or cohabit in the future. As I mentioned, most of the girls focused on independence first, and this desire for independence contrasted with what de Beauvoir calls the myth of Cinderella, whereby happiness was perceived as coming from the meeting of Prince Charming. And I think Austen, despite Austen focusing on marriage and considering the need for, or talking about and exploring the need for women to find a suitable husband that could look after them, then most definitely, I don't believe her novels were anywhere near the myth of Cinderella. It wasn't necessarily that happiness was going to come from meeting Prince Charming. It was more often Prince Charming was a necessity. So the girls in my research appear intent on creating their own opportunities and being self-reliant. The girls are prioritising themselves, valuing a good education and financial independence. And the girls, as I mentioned earlier, were often scathing about the contribution of men and boys in their lives and did not see a relationship as a way of improving their chances. So that contrasts with Austen's era and the need for a suitable marriage to improve the chances of women. However, I would say that potentially the tone in which that notion is discussed can be considered similar in many ways. But despite the girls' lack of focus on relationships and marriage in their imagined futures, this didn't stop the girls from discussing relationships with boys. When girls discussed social media, and part of the thread of my research was looking at media, the relationship between the girls and media, and obviously social media, so Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, etc., came up a lot. The girls talked a lot about social media and talked about how other girls presented themselves on social media. And the focus was always because other girls wanted to attract boys. So as the quotes say there on that slide, these girls on social media will put lots of makeup on, they will take pictures of themselves and they will post those pictures. And the girls that I was talking to suggested that was so they can get a boyfriend, or it's because of boys, so they can get a boyfriend. And the girls themselves that I was researching with denied wanting to attract boys, which was quite interesting. And I always sort of look at that with some skepticism, because the notion that all the other girls out there were worried about boys, but this little group of 30 girls that I worked with weren't, didn't necessarily ring true. But the situation remains that despite the protestations of independence and wanting careers, at the present time, boys were a concern for girls, and at least some of the girls wanted to appeal to boys in some way. This confirms the findings by Sanders and Mumford, whereby girls were concerned with the relationships in the present, but when they discussed their imagined futures, they were much more concerned with independence. Girls also assumed boys were of interest to each other and often discussed which boys, both celebrity and within their social group, were, in their terms, hot. This assumes a heteronormative discourse with assumptions around sexuality being unspoken. So although in many ways attracting a husband or boy romantically may be for different reasons between Austen's time and today, the comparison does still show that girls are still concerned with boys and relationships, and they do make assumptions about having relationships in the future, whereby a husband can support them when they have children. And this is something I'm going to move on to talk about in a minute. But there is still, underneath the girls' assumptions, is that when they have children, they will ideally be in a very settled relationship, probably married, and that partner or husband will take care of them while they have children. So again, the financial independence that girls are talking about does not necessarily ring true throughout all of the discussions, because just as Austen knows that women need some financial dependence or have financial dependence on men, the girls that I worked with are starting to assume that as well. Another theme that emerged, both from Austen's discussions and the girls, is this notion of equal relationships. Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth is looking for an equal partnership in her marriage. Even though she knows she's dependent upon a man to provide for her, she believes she should have some power in the relationship. And that very much reflects Wollstonecraft's view from the 18th century that men and women should have an equal partnership in marriage. Again, linking Austen's writing back to those early feminist views of Wollstonecraft. The response to inequality in marriage and the belief in his own superiority, Austen shows in the initial proposal of Darcy's power and status, which leads Elizabeth to reprimand him. And in her own way, through turning him down and reprimanding him, she ultimately is demanding respect. When they finally accept their feelings, the more equal footing of the relationship is established, assuming that Elizabeth and Darcy would therefore have a much more equal relationship, if not viewed equally by an external audience, it would be more equal within the confines of their own relationship. With the girls in my research, they actually assumed equality in terms of being listened to and having a say in their futures in a way that Austen demonstrated women did not have. However, in a similar way to Elizabeth looking for an equal partner, the girls also talked about wanting to demand respect and wanting a relationship based on an equal footing. All of the girls in my research imagined working in continuing education, even if they're not sure what they wanted to do in the future. They didn't envisage themselves as stay-at-home mums. So they definitely envisaged sharing the responsibility of the home and the children. Mac commented, "My main goal in life is to go to college and university. I haven't thought about whether I want to have children because I've thought about me and getting my career and everything." But those girls that did think about having children, so one quote was by Georgie and another by Olivia Rose, was that they did, if they imagined having children and imagined having partners, they expected to share the responsibility and work with their partners. And most of the girls pretty much commented on this, and if one girl brought it up, the other girls would reinforce the message that actually men should share responsibility. As Georgie said, she'd want days off from looking after children, and Olivia Rose points out it's both of our child, it's not just mine. And Chopped Up Millionaire also talks about, I don't think women should just give up work to look after children. So they want to do something. So it comes back to this notion of wanting to do something for themselves, and that actually if the woman wants to work, the man should share responsibility. Now, considering that I was working with working class girls, many of the girls talked in depth about their families, and they talked about how their mothers and fathers and the relationships at home with mothers and fathers, or mothers and stepfathers, or stepmums and fathers. So they talked about their home life quite a lot. And what became really evident in those conversations was that the role that they emulated, the role in the domestic sphere that they wanted to see, was that of equality and sharing responsibility. Some of the girls had that in their home life. Some of the girls talked openly about their mums and dads sort of juggling work and childcare, and my dad works during the day, my mum works in a pub at night, so I go home, my dad looks after us, my dad cooks dinner, my mum does this. And they very much, so these girls weren't saying that there wasn't equality at home. Some of the girls did have examples or role models that sort of modelled an equal relationship between their mums and dads. However, other girls definitely didn't have. And if we go back to Margaret and Mildred and their conversation earlier, they were really cross about the fact their fathers and their brothers did very little at home. And they rejected vehemently that inequality that they saw at home. And they were very strongly demanding that they wanted an equal share of responsibilities between partners and themselves in the future. So it didn't really matter what background the children or the girls that I worked with came from. They all spoke about wanting a future that was equal. So although equality is discussed in the relationship between Austen and the girls today is different in many ways, the essence remains the same. Just as Elizabeth was looking for an equal partner, so too are the girls. Moving on to another topic, or another theme that in some ways Jane Austen, it doesn't run through Jane Austen, but it may well be seen as Austen's response to this theme that was evident in literary sort of writings at the time. Morgan in 1989 examines Austen's literary inheritance and suggests that 18th century novels allowed a heroine to be one of two identities, either the virgin or the whore. Morgan suggests Jane Austen's innovation was to sever the connection between virgin or ignorance and whore and knowledge by introducing an entire canon of brilliantly visible, imaginatively influential women characters whose sexual experience isn't relevant. Although literature today allows a wider representation of the girls, something that emerged from my research is this continuing response to the virgin or whore dichotomy. Girls talked at length about media representations, both those they see and those they create through their own social media. And these suggested the messages the girls receive are they should look sexy, but they shouldn't be sexual, or they can either be perceived as pure and virginal or promiscuous and easy. When discussing representations of women in media, the girls were often outspoken about the bad girl or good girl image. The reflection of the virgin or the good girl is evident in many of the Disney films and TV shows the girl watched, and is central to the position of women in the public sphere, where the virgin-whore dichotomy has long been at the heart of female fame. This links to the classic double standard, whereby girls are judged for being too sexual, but at the same time they're judged if they're not sexy enough. And Austen was writing at a time where she was responding to that and effectively trying to move her characters away from that virgin or whore dichotomy. And the girls themselves are actually trying to respond to that dichotomy today. They're trying to carve out a space for themselves whereby they're neither a virgin or a whore. But in doing that, they are quite critical of each other. And they're critical of themselves. They often, when they were talking about this notion of being sexy or sexual, or some people representing themselves as sexy on social media, they would often be critical, but they'd equally try and justify why they maybe had then worn clothes that was quite similar. So comments such as, I wore shorts, but they weren't that short, or I wore a crop top, but it had tassels, so it didn't show my midriff. So there was a constant running through the girls' lives, as much as it was running through Austen's literature or the literary inheritance at the time, was this sort of dichotomy between good and bad, or pure and whore, basically. And that hasn't been solved for the girls today. Moving on to economic power. Judith Newton argues Austen saw women's lives as restricted and lacking in autonomy. But Newton argued the economic inequality rather than political patriarchy to be the cause. It's the right of Austen's men to have work that pays and to rise through preference and education, whereas women must marry for their fortune or inherit it. Austen shows men for all their money and privilege are not permitted to be powerful though, and women for all their impotence are not seen as victims of economic restriction. So Newton argued that actually, despite the economic position of women, Austen worked a way around this. Newton read Pride and Prejudice as decoupling economics from power, and Elizabeth. Elizabeth, as an unmarried middle-class woman without a fortune, was a most authentic, powerful figure in the novel, and Elizabeth's intelligence mitigates her economic and social deficiencies. Whether you agree with Newton's reading or not, one thing most critics agree on are the novels that Austen wrote highlight how some female characters take charge of their own worlds while others are confined. Almost all of Austen's work explores the precarious economic situation in which women of the late 18th and early 19th century found themselves. Austen addresses issues relating to money and property, particularly the arbitrary quality of property inheritance and the precarious economic position of women. And there's a tension between the claims of society and the claims of the individual. However, whilst women are now in a position to earn their own money and hopefully be in a less precarious economic state than in Austen's time, it has to be highlighted that women continue to be more economically at risk than men. Those women that do earn, unfortunately, globally, earn 24% less on average than men. Coupled with a number of other risk factors in terms of work that we do not have time to explore today, I could probably talk for another 45 minutes about the economic position of women, which is not why we're here. So, returning to the socialist feminist arguments, women's economic situation can be examined through the mutual interdependence between capitalism and patriarchy. Eisenstein, a feminist from the 1970s, called this capitalist patriarchy. So although the girls I worked with didn't actually articulate themselves as feminists, a feminist tone emerged through these discussions. They discussed women's roles and the inequality they were aware of, and suggested women should be able to do anything and should have equal opportunities and power, both economically and socially, to men. The girls were surprisingly aware of the economic inequality that existed. And linked to that were these representations of the power and economic agency of men versus the lack of for women. So one of my girls commented, the media shows girls as pretty and stuff, but never do anything with jobs. It's like all we think about is our looks. Another commented, because you're a woman doesn't mean you should be limited as to what jobs you can do. No one should be limited to what they can do. And as Mildred says here, woman is not a limit to what you can do. So they didn't necessarily talk about economic situation purely in that sense, but actually what they were really aware of was the fact that certain jobs were limited or in many ways may be frowned upon for women, and those jobs were often the ones that paid the most or provided a launch pad for women to climb the career ladder. So while the economic situation for girls today is different to girls in Austen's era, the need for equal economic power continues to be a concern, and the girls were aware of that. Despite arguing that Austen's novels have feminist elements, scholars have still noticed that women are frequently represented as confined, with very few depictions of female authority figures. Austen highlights the lack of women as authority figures, but also not only as authority figures, but also how they're represented in history. She almost points the finger at this absence of women. Alongside the absence of women from positions of authority in history, Austen shows women as literally confined in small spaces and constrained by social factors such as miseducation and financial dependency. Gilbert and Gubar argue Austen shows how women must acquiesce to their confinement, no matter how stifling it is, because they're too vulnerable in the world at large. And again, sort of this notion of women being confined and women never being able to have sort of the power or to be a figure of authority ran through the discussion that we had. And in Persuasion, Anne Elliot describes the differences between men and women. We live at home, quiet and confined, our feelings prey upon us. You're forced on exertion, you always have a profession, pursuits, business of some sort or another to take you back into the world immediately, and continual occupation and change soon weakens the prescience. Butler points out that Austen's novels lack depictions of female mentors or authority figures. In the novels, Butler argues women do not progress from ignorance to knowledge. Many of them are oddly or even unnaturally ineffective. They marry authority figures. And Gilbert and Gubar points out that Austen really pointed the finger at how becoming a woman means relinquishing achievement and accommodating oneself to men in the spaces they provide. So in Persuasion, as Mary and Louisa grow up, they lose their independence and become reliant on those around them. Austen examines the female powerlessness that underlies monetary pressure to marry, and the injustice of inheritance laws, and the ignorance of women denied formal education. The girls in my research also commented on the lack of authority figures they see in their lives. Women are always shown as weak. Like in every time I watch something, the girl, the female, always ends up cleaning, doing the weak stuff, and the man saves the day. He's a hero, it's never the opposite way around, according to Peony Baby. Now that was talking about media. However, the girls also pointed to other representations, how in school they saw more male managers, that when they saw politicians, they saw more men. And actually they even talked about the fact that language reflects this. So those occupations that are perceived as or signified as powerful or heroic are often perceived as male or signifying masculinity. They spent quite a long time talking about, how we use the term fireman still or policeman still, and how that authority figure is assumed male. And politician is often assumed male because when you see it written in a newspaper, it will be a female politician. If you talk about a politician, it's just assumed male. So the girls very much considered that they lacked the authority figures that you could reflectively argue Austen pointed out back in the 18th century. We see more figures of authority that are female now, but they're still lacking. So ultimately, the girls would argue that I worked with, and Austen would probably argue herself, that it's not fair. The existence of female consciousness is suggested in Austen's first five novels, Northanger Abbey, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park and Emma. Although her women characters lead restricted lives, her novels are not about restriction or even expression, but about the relationships between the two, and about how women find ways to develop and assert their womanhood despite the restrictions placed on them. And how the world is often moulded by the girl or the woman, and she has been moulded by the world. In a similar vein, the girls showed they were involved in constantly balancing the pressures of what it is to be feminine or acceptable. The girls that I worked with demonstrated that the performance of femininity is clearly shown through the regulation of their bodies and each other's bodies on social media, but also of their critique of women in media due to perceived femininity that is performed. So just as the women are restricted in Austen in terms of how they should behave and how they should conduct themselves, the girls that I worked with maintained that they still had to conduct themselves in a particular way. And they did talk a lot about the notion of ladylike and how their families often wanted them to be more ladylike. Femininity was not something the girls I worked with suggested they possessed. It was a public performance dependent upon validation by others. The notion of they don't recognise themselves by the category of femininity, but their appearance among other practices is central to how they know themselves. This suggests that women are not feminine by default, but that femininity is carefully constructed and displayed. Moving on to the final thoughts. When Elizabeth met Lady Catherine de Bourgh and said to her about Mr. Darcy, he's a gentleman and I'm a gentleman's daughter, so far we are equal. Arguably, critics suggest that's the first time that Elizabeth can truly be portrayed as a feminist character. Feminism as a doctrine equates women and men equally, and this moment when Elizabeth declares herself equal to Mr. Darcy is when Elizabeth emerges as the feminist. Similarly, the girls in my research did not ever question their equality to men and boys. They wholeheartedly believed they were equal, but they were aware that ultimately it did not matter how they saw themselves, but rather how society saw them. They pointed to unequal treatment throughout school, through home life and through their hobbies, whereby boys and men benefit from women's positions. They spoke with a passion and anger about not being allowed to use the same gym equipment or play the same sports, or being expected to clear lesson material away while boys didn't have to, or the expectation they'll help at home while brothers didn't have to. They were only too aware that they were not equal in the eyes of wider society. So as much as Elizabeth maintained she started as equal, and the girls maintain that they are equal, both Elizabeth and the girls know society has not yet reached the same conclusion. Austen's novels vigorously critique the patriarchal structures of her day. They bristle with anger and a deep sense of injustice. And the conversation I had with the girls mirrored this. The issues may not be identical, and yes, times have changed, but the girls I worked with were still attempting to resist the patriarchal structures that impact on their lives, and they were angry about it. They were angry about the inequality they see and experience. Austen's novels contain insightful contemporary critiques of patriarchy. They throw a searching light on the ways in which those same injustices continue to inflict widespread and long-term damage. When I first talked to a couple of friends about speaking today, often, or a couple of them commented how it'd be interesting because the feminine in Austen's work would be so different from now, and how the girls that I talked to would be so much further on. However, unfortunately, I don't believe this is the case. The patriarchal structures Austen saw continue to impact on girls and women today. We may be able to be more outspoken about it. We may have far more rights than Austen ever could have dreamed of. But actually, essentially, the fight for equality continues. And that's it from me.
Well, thank you very much, Georgina. There was a lot of really interesting things to consider there. In particular, the idea that Jane Austen was a socialist, and the use of the word ladylike by today's girls, which of course would have been absolutely what Jane Austen would have recognised as being essential. So that was really interesting. Now, we've got quite a few people who are wanting to ask questions. I'm hoping that they put themselves into the chat room.
Oh, right. There's the chat room.
Wait a minute. I need to. I'm not quite sure what I need to do, actually. I need to get into the chat room. How do I do that? I've got my daughter on tap. So
there's a button that says chat next to share screen, so maybe you can do that.
Okay, I've got some questions now.
Okay. Everyone's saying hello.
Hello to everybody. I've got so many people. It's really exciting.
Okay. There you go. Let's start from
you mentioned Lady Catherine de Bourgh. I've got a question from Mary Ellen, who asks, what do you think of Lady Catherine de Bourgh as a power figure, despite how foolish she is in the novel?
Well, I think she is indisputably powerful, but within the confines of her gender, because actually what she's concerned with is ultimately the relationships that are playing out. And again, it links back to that notion of the personal. She's really concerned with the personal sphere and the domestic sphere and the relationships that are happening. So she is powerful, but powerful within the confines of the domestic, is what I think anyway.
Right, thank you for that. Now I've got another question here. This is from Mimi Otavi. I'm not quite sure where she is, but never mind. Hello, Mimi. She says, what do you think of the term strong female character? A lot of discussion has been had around the way women are portrayed in hero roles, commonly attached to some kind of male figure, despite their independence, or having men be their weakness and or downfall. Do you feel these characters are still valuable icons of representation, or do they do more harm than good?
That's really interesting, because actually in some ways I'd rather answer with what my girls thought, I suppose, because again, coming back to giving those girls a voice, they spent a lot of time, I mean, they tied me in knots with this one, because to be quite honest, they spent a lot of time arguing amongst themselves about whether a character could be strong and female, and exactly that, the fact that often these strong characters either had a flaw of some sort, or as the Mimi mentioned, they had a downfall. So strong characters such as, they talked about Miley Cyrus as potentially a strong feminist character on the one hand, but obviously over-sexualising herself on the other, which was her downfall. Or the fact that, heroes or heroines that were potentially strong then ended up settling for men. So I think I would say I do have a problem with the notion of the strong female character, because actually one day maybe we'll talk about just the strong character. And then we really will be talking about equality, because actually gender won't matter. And the girls definitely had a real argument about whether a strong female character truly existed, because often, particularly in Hollywood films, but in a lot of films and in a lot of literature, the strong female character ultimately has to sacrifice something to be strong, or has to sacrifice her strength to be happy. So women are rarely allowed to have it all. So the strong female character often lacks something in another way.
Thank you. I've got another question here from Eleanor Hebden, who wants to know, does social class play into the portrayal of feminism in Austen's work, or are they separate entities?
I think in many ways it does. I mean, I will hold my hands up, and I am a socialist feminist, obviously, as you could tell, because I've written my research from a socialist feminist perspective. But I think going back to the sort of the discussion about Lady Catherine, she is a powerful woman, and probably one of the most powerful women in the novel because of her class position. The lower your class position, the less power you essentially have. So class does run through Austen's novels in the same way as gender does, because actually the women with the least power are often those women that have the least economic resources to hand, and therefore are in the lower class position, which directly reflects the class position of the UK today.
Right, well, we've got another one here from Daisy Houlihan, who says, it appeared your idea, or your girl's idea of an equal marriage is one where both parents are working. And she goes on to say, do equal roles really have to mean the same roles? Can't families with one stay-at-home parent and one working parent still have a respectful and equal relationship?
I absolutely agree. I think you can, and I think as long as it's an equal choice, and that's the key, I think, that came through a lot of my research, that there was no such thing often as equal choice, because the class or gendered position of the girls meant their choices weren't as equal as other people's. Yes, in a family, that if it's an equal choice that one parent stays at home and one parent works, absolutely fine. And the girls didn't always say that both parents had to work equally. A lot of the girls did talk about the notion of working part-time, but they still expected their partners, or assume, and it was very much assumed husbands and assumed heteronormativity. Even if they had decided that they might work part-time in the future, and obviously this is 11 and 12-year-old girls imagining a future from a long way away, they still expected that their partners would help out. So they didn't always imagine work to be of equal amount between both them and their husbands, but they expected the husbands to pull their weight.
Quite right. Absolutely. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. I've got another question here from Marion Davies. I don't know where she is, but she says, what do you think of Mrs. Elton in Emma when she criticises Mr. Weston for opening his wife's letters and then goes on to say how she will always stand up for women?
Well, I think it's an interesting one because actually women supporting women is great. And we could all learn something from that. And in some ways does that not in many ways reflect the sisterhood of the feminist movement of the 1920s and then, or the 19 teens and then the 1960s and 70s. I think Austen does have a sort of message throughout that women do look after and look out for other women, and women collectively can be quite powerful. So I like that notion and that character.
Now we've got one from Amelia Platt, who wants to know, is Jane Austen's feminist legacy underappreciated in today's society? And she goes on to talk about the Austen-inspired merchandise focuses on the romantic aspect of her work.
Absolutely, I do. I really, and I think, unfortunately, as much as I maybe am guilty of appreciating and liking, the films that really focus on the romantic aspects of Austen, I do think that it has been slightly Hollywooded, if that's such a word. Often, I think you have to think of sort of people that enjoy Austen's work as those people that really enjoy Austen's work and really get to grips with the themes and read between the lines and listen to the covert messages that she has in her novels. And then you've got those people that are maybe quite like her books, watch all the films, and they don't really delve deeply. So I think often the feminist messages do get ignored, and the feminist messages have become almost dumbed down. Because let's face it, we've gone through quite an era recently where feminism most certainly wasn't fashionable and wasn't trendy, and it wasn't the done thing to say you're a feminist. So why would people therefore talk about Austen being a feminist? Because that might jeopardise her fans in some ways. So I think Austen's romantic sort of has been romanticised in many ways, and I think that's a real shame. And I think we really need to sort of say, actually, she wasn't just writing romantic fiction from the confines of her home and thinking everything was lovely. She was actually offering quite a shrewd critique of the world that she lived in, that actually, I hope I've sort of convinced some of you, is still often similar to the world that we live in today.
And I'd agree with that. Another question here is from Elizabeth Susha. Virginia Woolf said Austen didn't show anger. Do you agree with that?
There's different ways of showing anger. And I think she did show anger in a way that was probably entirely, going back to the word, entirely ladylike and appropriate. She had to be careful. I mean, when she was writing, she couldn't, unlike the girls that I worked with that could rant and rage about the inequality and unjustness of the world and how it's not fair, Jane Austen didn't have that freedom. So what she actually did was very cleverly critiqued from within in a way that made people think rather than just be angry about it. Anger doesn't always get us where we want to be. And she had to be careful about being angry, I believe.
Well, you had to be very careful indeed. I've got a few people who want to know where they can read your dissertation.
Well, because it's so new, it should be online through De Montfort University Library, so that's an academic access. But if people really want to read it, then if they can let you or somebody know email addresses, I can send the whole 80,000 words over if they really want to read it. I don't want to read it again.
Well, we've also got somebody who wants to know, really and truly, was Jane Austen a feminist, or was she perhaps just playing at being a feminist?
I think she was. Definitely. Why would she play at being a feminist?
Well, no.
That would be my question to the person that posed the question. Why would Jane Austen play at being a feminist? She had nothing to gain from playing at being a feminist, and you know, she did what does feminism mean? A belief in equality, but also for many women, being a feminist means actually making your own way in life, and she did. You know, she could have opted for the trying to find a suitable man and getting married, but she chose to write, and so therefore chose to have a voice, and that's not the easy option.
No, it certainly isn't. I think this might be the last question, actually, from Sabrina Jones. I know Mrs. Bennet is always depicted as foolish, but in her situation, 5 daughters and an entailment, do you think she acted as a stronger character than Mr. Bennet and his inactivity?
Absolutely. I mean, she is depicted as foolish, and she is. I find her quite amusing as a character, but actually, she had a mission that she needed to achieve.
Yeah.
She has 5 daughters, and at that time, for a woman with 5 daughters of not a huge sort of economic importance, she needed to marry those daughters off. So she was actually very strong and very single-minded in what she was trying to do. And she did, let's face it, she did really have her daughter's best interests at heart, as far as she possibly could control them. You know, she didn't want them just to marry anybody. She did want them to marry up. So I do see her as I see her as the driving force, far more than Mr. Bennet is.
Well, I actually agree with you. She is an extraordinarily irritating woman, and I always wonder how on earth Mr. Bennet married her. She was presumably just a pretty face. But yes, she had a mission to get her daughters married and off her hands. So in that, she certainly was working hard. Another question here, which comes from Nicola. I don't know where Nicola is. Maybe Bath. Did the girls in your research talk about the Me Too movement? And what do you think Jane Austen would say about this?
The primary research that I did with the girls was just before the Me Too movement. So the Me Too movement was 2018, I believe, and I actually completed my primary research in 2017. So they came slightly before the Me Too movement. In terms of, it's interesting, what would Jane Austen think of the Me Too movement? Well, maybe she'd embrace it, and maybe, you know, there is a theme of sisterhood, let's face it, running through Jane Austen's work. So actually supporting women and being concerned for women, maybe she would have appreciated it.
Maybe, yeah. That's one of the imponderables. You never know anything like that. Right, well now this one really is the very last question from Philippa Sondheimer. What do you think about Emma? Economically independent, but still subservient?
Economically independent, but still knows her place, I think. And still knows that actually she really does have a role to fulfill, and you can't. And again, it's Austen's commentary on, despite the economic independence, there is still a position for women in society. Women can't just go and live and be. They still have these constraints and confinements that restrict their lives.
Yeah, absolutely, I'd agree with that. But I found it very interesting that Emma, when she says, when I can't do this, I'm going to do something else. So I will always be an independent woman if I never marry, because of course she had the money, so it didn't matter to her.
Yeah.
Well, I think now we have really run out of questions. So what I'm going to do is to thank you very much indeed, Georgina, for a really interesting evening. We've had a lot of people who've said how much they've enjoyed it. They want to read your dissertation. Somebody says they're going to email you about getting in touch. And somebody else in America said she's got so many questions that she can relate and use in her own classes with girls. So you've obviously...
I am always more than happy for people to get in touch with me. As I said, my thesis and talking about my thesis is completely self-indulgent. So, I'm more than happy to talk about it. I've loved doing this talk, actually, because it means I get to revisit it from a slightly different perspective, because obviously I never intended my research to be about, I never expected the girls to be as feminist as they were, and it was refreshing and great. And linking that to something like Jane Austen is fabulous. So I've enjoyed it, and if anybody does need to get in touch or want to get in touch, I'm more than happy for them to.
Well, there you are. So everybody who's listening, if you want to get in touch with Georgina, she's going to be very happy for you to do that. So I'm going to thank her once more for a really interesting evening. I'm also going to thank Andreas for organising it behind the scenes, because he's been letting you all in and keeping you under control, which I couldn't possibly have done. So once again, thank you to Georgina, and thank you to Andreas, and a big, big thank you to everybody who came and joined in this Zoom talk. It was really good to have so many of you, and thank you again, and maybe you'll turn up for our next one, which we haven't quite organised. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody. Good evening.